Harlem did not sleep the way other places did. It breathed. It listened. It remembered. On certain nights, when the streetlights flickered just enough to cast long shadows across Lenox Avenue, the city seemed to hold its breath as if it knew. Something was about to happen, something that would echo far beyond a single moment. This was one of those nights. The kind where silence felt heavier than noise, where footsteps carried meaning, and where men who understood the streets instinctively kept their voices low. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson moved through that silence like he belonged to it, not disturbing it, not fighting it, just existing within it with a calm that most men could never learn. He wore no expression that gave anything away, no sign of urgency or concern, and yet people noticed when he passed. They always did. Not because he demanded attention, but because something about him made people aware of themselves, of how they stood, how they spoke, how they acted. That was his power, not fear. Not noise, presence, but even presence had been tested lately. The city had begun to shift in subtle, uncomfortable ways. Not overnight, not loudly, but slowly, like a door being pushed open inch by inch until one day you realized it was no longer closed. Dutch Schultz's influence had been growing, stretching into Harlem with the kind of confidence that didn't come from understanding the community, but from underestimating it. His men carried themselves differently, louder, sharper, careless, in ways that spoke of borrowed authority rather than earned respect. At first, it had been small things. A store owner spoken to with just a little too much edge. A conversation interrupted where it shouldn't have been. A presence that felt less like business and more like intrusion. Most men noticed. Few reacted. Bumpy noticed everything. He said nothing. Because he understood something most didn't. Real power doesn't rush. It observes. It waits. It chooses its moment carefully. Because once it moves, it doesn't need to move again. That night, the air felt wrong. It wasn't something you could explain easily, but the older men sitting outside the barbershop felt it in their bones. Conversations were shorter. Laughter didn't carry as far. Even the music spilling out from open windows seemed quieter, like it was trying not to draw attention. Bumpy stepped into a small restaurant on the corner, a place that had known him long before his name carried weight. The owner greeted him with respect, not fear, and that mattered more than anything else. Respect meant something here. It wasn't taken. It was given, earned over time through consistency, through character, through the quiet understanding that some men protected more than themselves. He sat, ordered simply, and listened. That was when the door opened. The shift was immediate. Not loud, not dramatic, but noticeable. Conversations paused just a fraction longer than usual. Eyes moved, then quickly looked away. The kind of reaction that told you everything without saying a word. Two of Schultz's men walked in. They didn't belong, not in the way that mattered. It wasn't about race or territory alone. It was about how they carried themselves. There was no awareness in their movement, no respect for the space they were entering. They spoke too loudly, laughed too easily, and looked around like they were measuring something they didn't understand. One of them bumped into a chair harder than necessary, no apology. The room tightened. Bumpy didn't look up immediately. He continued eating, unhurried, as if nothing had changed. But those who knew him understood. He had noticed the moment it happened. He always did. The men ordered drinks, their voices cutting through the room with a sharpness that felt deliberate. They weren't just present, they were performing, testing, pushing boundaries not because they needed to, but because they wanted to see how far they could go. And that was always the mistake. Because Harlem was not a place you tested. It was a place you respected, or it taught you why you should have. Minutes passed. Nothing escalated. Nothing exploded. And yet the tension didn't leave it settled, like something waiting just beneath the surface. When Bumpy finished his meal, he stood calmly, adjusted his coat, and walked toward the door. As he passed the two men, One of them glanced at him. A smirk forming, not aggressive, not yet, but careless in a way that revealed everything about how little he understood. "Evenin'," the man said, tone light, almost mocking. Bumpy paused. Not long, just enough. He turned slightly, meeting the man's eyes not with anger, not with challenge, but with a level of calm that made the room feel smaller. "Evenin'," he replied, nothing more. Then he walked out. It seemed like nothing. To most, it was nothing. But to those who understood, it was everything. Because Bumpy had acknowledged them, but he had not accepted them, and in that difference, a line had been drawn. Outside, the night air felt heavier. The streetlights buzzed faintly, casting shadows that stretched longer than they should have. Bumpy walked without hurry, hands steady, mind clear. He didn't need to discuss what had happened. He didn't need to react, because he already knew where this was going. The problem wasn't the men in that restaurant. The problem was what they represented. Disrespect never arrives all at once. It starts small. It tests. It grows. And if no one corrects it, it becomes something far more difficult to control. Bumpy wasn't thinking about the moment that had just passed. He was thinking about the moment that would come next. Because it always did. And when it did, it would not be handled with anger. It would be handled with precision. Back inside the restaurant, the room slowly returned to life, but something had changed. The owner stood behind the counter a little longer than usual. His eyes fixed on the door Bumpy had just walked through. He didn't say anything, but the thought was there, unspoken and shared by others in the room. They don't understand what they're doing. And somewhere else in the city, far from the quiet dignity of Harlem streets, Dutch Schultz sat in a room filled with noise, laughter, glasses clinking, voices layered over one another in a chaotic rhythm that sounded nothing like the calm. Outside, he was a man used to control, used to movement, used to the idea that if something could be taken, it should be. And lately, he had been looking at Harlem the same way. Not as a place with its own rules, but as an opportunity. That was his second mistake. Because Harlem wasn't quiet out of weakness. It was quiet out of understanding. And men like Bumpy Johnson didn't respond to noise. They responded to meaning. And meaning, once set in motion, could not be undone. The night stretched on, but the balance had already begun to shift. No one announced it. No one declared it. But it was there, waiting, building. And somewhere between silence and consequence, a story had begun, one that would not be told through violence, but through something far more powerful, a reminder. That respect, once tested, does not ask for permission to return. It simply does. Sometimes the quietest moments are the ones that decide everything. By the time the second night settled over Harlem, the silence from before had not faded, it had deepened. It was no longer the quiet of uncertainty. It was the quiet of awareness. People moved the same, spoke the same, lived their routines as they always had, but beneath it all, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Those who understood the rhythm of the streets felt it immediately. The balance had tilted, not violently, not visibly, but enough that even the smallest action now carried weight. Bumpy Johnson noticed it the moment he stepped outside that evening, the air holding a tension that wasn't loud, but was unmistakably present. It lingered in the way conversations paused just a second too long, in the way people watched corners before turning them, in the way even the wind seemed to carry something heavier than before. He walked through it calmly, his pace unchanged, his expression steady. If there was a storm coming, he was not the kind of man who ran from it. He was the kind who stood still long enough to understand its direction. The previous night had not been about two careless men in a restaurant. It had been about something larger, about a test that had begun quietly, but was now continuing in ways that would not remain small for long. Bumpy understood that better than anyone. Disrespect, once introduced, did not retreat on its own. Either grew, or it was corrected, and correction required patience. Across the city, Dutch Schultz had taken the silence for weakness. To him, the lack of immediate reaction was not discipline, it was opportunity. He had built his world on that misunderstanding, believing that control came from pushing forward, without hesitation, from taking space until no one dared to question it. But Harlem was not built on fear, it was built on memory. And memory had a way of reminding people who they were, especially when that identity was threatened. That evening, Bumpy returned home later than usual, his presence quiet but grounding, like a steady anchor in a world beginning to drift. His wife met him with the same calm strength she always carried, her eyes reflecting both understanding and concern without needing to speak it aloud. She had seen enough of life to know when something was changing, and though no words were exchanged about it, there was an unspoken awareness between them, a shared recognition that the days ahead would not be ordinary. They spoke softly over dinner, not about conflict, not about the city, but about simple things, the kind of conversations that remind you what truly matters when everything else begins to feel uncertain. It was in those moments, away from the noise of the streets, that Bumpy found clarity. Because for him, this was never about pride or control. It was about protection of dignity, of community, of the quiet life that people deserved without fear or humiliation. Later that night, the incident happened. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of moment that stops a city in its tracks. But it was the kind that changes everything. The staircase was narrow, tucked inside a building that had seen generations pass through its worn steps. It was the kind of place where people moved carefully, where each step carried the weight of time. And on that staircase, a moment of carelessness, no. Not carelessness, something worse unfolded in a way that no one present would ever forget. One of Schultz's men, emboldened by the absence of consequence, crossed a line he did not even recognize as sacred. There was no argument, no escalation, no reason, just an act driven by arrogance, by the belief that actions carried no real weight, and in that single moment, he pushed Bumpy's pregnant wife down the stairs. The sound of it, the sudden shift, the gasp, the impact, echoed in a way that seemed to freeze time itself. For a second, no one moved, because even those who had grown used to disrespect knew instinctively this was different. This was not business. This was not territory. This was something no man with any understanding of dignity would ever allow. People rushed to her side, voices breaking through the silence, hands trembling as they tried to help. The man who had caused it stood there, the confidence in his posture faltering for just a moment, not out of remorse, but out of the sudden realization that something irreversible had just happened. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the moment ended. But its consequences did not. Word spread the way it always did in Harlem, not loudly, not publicly, and with precision. By the time Bumpy heard what had happened, the details were already clear, carried through voices that did not exaggerate, did not dramatize, but spoke with the kind of certainty that left no room for doubt. And when he listened, he did not interrupt. He did not ask questions. He did not react. He simply stood there, absorbing every word, his expression unchanged, his silence heavier than anything anyone could have said. Those who delivered the message expected something, anger, movement, a sign that something immediate would follow. But Bumpy did nothing. At least, nothing they could see. He turned, walked out into the night, and disappeared into the same quiet streets that had always understood him better than words ever could. And that was when the city began to shift, not in chaos, not in violence, but in something far more powerful. The next morning, doors opened a little slower for Schultz's men. Conversations ended a little quicker when they entered rooms. Deliveries were delayed, not denied, just delayed. Information that once flowed freely began to stall, as if the city itself had decided to take a step back. No one announced it. No one coordinated it, but everyone understood. This was not retaliation, this was withdrawal. Because Harlem had seen something it could not ignore. And it responded the only way it knew how, with quiet unity. Bumpy spent those hours not reacting, but observing. He moved through the city like he always had, speaking to people not about what had happened, but about what mattered. He reminded them, without saying it directly, that dignity was not something anyone could take unless it was given away. And Harlem, for all its struggles, had never been a place that surrendered its identity easily. By the end of the first day, the effects were undeniable. Schultz's operations began to feel the strain, not from attack, but from absence. Things that had once been easy became complicated. People who had once cooperated became distant. And, for the first time, there was confusion not about what had happened, but about why the response felt so controlled, because they had expected anger. They had expected retaliation. What they had not expected was discipline. On the second night, Bumpy finally made his move, not through force, not through confrontation, but through presence. He entered a room where Schultz's closest men gathered, their conversations halting the moment he stepped inside. The atmosphere tightened, not because he demanded it, but because his presence required it. He didn't look at them with hostility, didn't carry himself with threat. He simply stood there, calm, composed, completely certain of himself. And then he spoke, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "A man can make a mistake," he said, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. "But there are some mistakes that tell you who he believes he is." The room remained silent because they understood. This was not a warning, it was a statement. And in that statement was a choice. Not just for them, but for everything. That would come next. Bumpy didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one, because the message had already been delivered. And outside, Harlem stood exactly where it had always been, watching, waiting, and ready to remind anyone who had forgotten that some lines are not meant to be crossed. And once they are not handled with anger. They are answered with truth. The moment they crossed the line, they stopped being in control of what happened next. By the third day, Harlem no longer felt tense, it felt decided. Not loud, not chaotic, not visibly divided, but settled in a way that only comes when people stop waiting to see what will happen and begin to understand what must happen. The uncertainty that had hovered over the streets had quietly dissolved, replaced by something steadier, something rooted in shared awareness. No one held meetings to agree on it. No one stood in the streets making declarations. But it was there, moving through conversations, through glances, through the subtle ways people chose where to stand and who to stand with. And at the center of that stillness stood Bumpy Johnson, unchanged, unhurried, and more present than ever. He had not raised his voice. He had not issued commands. He had not chased the man responsible. And yet, everything had begun to move exactly where it needed to. Because what he understood, what many never did, was that real correction did not come from force. It came from clarity. From creating a moment where people could no longer hide behind excuses, where they were forced to see themselves not as they imagined, but as they truly were. And that moment was approaching. Schultz, however, was beginning to feel something he had not expected. Pressure. Not the kind that comes from confrontation, but the kind that builds quietly, invisibly, until it reaches a point where even the strongest men begin to question their footing. His operations had not collapsed, but they had slowed in ways that did not make sense to him. Nothing had been taken from him directly, no territory lost, no visible rebellion, but something essential had shifted. Trust. People still worked with him, but differently. They spoke less freely. They hesitated where they hadn't before. And perhaps most unsettling of all, there was a distance now. A subtle but undeniable separation, that made it clear he was no longer moving through Harlem with the same acceptance he once assumed he had. He couldn't confront it, because there was nothing to confront, and that was what made it powerful. Inside his circle, the conversation had begun to change. Not openly, not boldly, but in small, careful remarks that revealed something deeper. One man mentioned a delayed delivery. Another noted how a familiar contact had suddenly become unavailable. And though no one said it directly, the connection was there, hanging in the air like a truth waiting to be acknowledged. This wasn't coincidence. This was response. But not the kind they knew how to fight. Meanwhile, Bumpy moved through Harlem with the same quiet authority he had always carried. But now it felt heavier, not burdened, not strained, just more defined. People didn't stop him to ask what would happen next. They didn't need to. They saw it in the way he carried himself, in the calm certainty that did not waver, in the absence of doubt that made everything else feel smaller. He visited places that had been part of his life long before conflict ever entered the picture. A small bookstore where the owner greeted him with a nod that carried both respect and gratitude. A cafe where conversations resumed the moment he sat down, not because people weren't aware of what was happening, but because his presence reassured them that whatever was unfolding would not spiral into chaos. That was his gift. Not control, stability. And stability, once recognized, becomes something people protect. But even stability has its moment of decision. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the city shifted into its night rhythm, Bumpy received a message, not urgent, not frantic, but deliberate. It came from someone who understood both sides of the line that had been crossed. Someone who had seen enough to know that what was happening now could not continue without consequence. The message was simple. They're starting to understand. Bumpy read it once, then folded it away. Because understanding was not enough. Understanding without action was just awareness. And awareness without change meant nothing. Elsewhere, the man responsible for the incident on the staircase had begun to feel the shift more directly than anyone else. At first, he dismissed it. The silence, the distance, the subtle changes in how people looked at him, it all seemed insignificant, something that would pass once things returned to normal. But nothing returned to normal. He found himself walking into rooms where conversations stopped, not out of fear, but out of judgment. He noticed the absence of small courtesies he had once taken for granted. And most telling of all, he began to feel something unfamiliar creeping in uncertainty. Not about what he had done, but about what it meant. Because deep down, beneath the layers of arrogance and assumption, there was a realization forming, slow, uncomfortable, undeniable. He had not just made a mistake. He had revealed something about himself, and now everyone could see it. By the time night fully settled over Harlem, the weight of that realization had spread beyond one man. It had reached Schultz's inner circle, pressing against the edges of their confidence, forcing them to confront something they had not considered before, that this situation was no longer about control, or business, or territory. It was about legitimacy, and legitimacy cannot be forced. It must be recognized. That was when Bumpy chose to act again. Not publicly, not dramatically, but precisely. He arranged a meeting, not with Schultz himself, but with the men who stood closest to him. The kind of meeting that didn't require invitations, didn't need formal agreement. It was understood, accepted, and attended because not showing up would have said more than showing up ever could. The room was quiet when he entered, not tense, not hostile, just aware. Bumpy didn't take a central position. He didn't place himself above anyone else. He simply stood where he could be seen, where his presence filled the space without overwhelming it. His expression was calm, his posture steady, his eyes clear. He let the silence settle. Because silence, when used correctly, speaks louder than any argument. Then, after a moment that felt longer than it was, he spoke. Required no emphasis. And I didn't come here to give you something you don't already have. No one interrupted. No one shifted, because they knew this wasn't negotiation. This was definition. What happened, he continued, wasn't just wrong. A pause. It was revealing. The word lingered, revealing, because it pointed not just to the action, but to the mindset behind it. Quietly, but to push someone who carries life, and walk away like it means nothing. He let the sentence fade. He didn't need to finish it. They understood. This city, he went on, his tone never rising, never sharpening, has rules that don't need to be written down. You learn them by living here. You respect them by understanding why they exist. Another pause. And when someone shows they don't understand, his gaze moved slowly across the room. The city responds. There was no threat. In his words, no promise of retaliation. Just truth, clear, unavoidable, and that was what made it impossible to ignore. For the first time since this began, the men in that room were not thinking about power. They were thinking about consequence. Not the kind they could fight, but the kind they had already begun to feel. Bumpy didn't wait for agreement. He didn't ask for acknowledgement, because what needed to be said. He turned, walked out of the room, and left them there, with the silence, with the weight, with the realization that something had already begun to move beyond their control. Outside, Harlem felt different again, not tense, not uncertain, but closer to resolution. Because the truth had been spoken, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly enough that it could not be denied. And now the choice belonged to them. To continue as they were, or to change before the city decided for them. When truth is spoken calmly, it becomes impossible to escape doubt. By the fourth night, Harlem no longer felt like it was waiting. It felt like it had already chosen. The streets carried a different kind of energy, not tense, not restless, but settled in a way that only comes when a community decides where it stands. Conversations flowed again, but with a quiet certainty behind them. Doors opened and closed with intention. People moved with awareness, not fear. It wasn't that the memory of what had happened had faded. It hadn't. It had simply found its place. No longer a question, but a truth that had already begun to shape what came next. And in the center of it all, Bumpy Johnson remained exactly who he had always been: calm, composed, and unshaken. But now his silence carried something different. Finality. The message had already been delivered. The understanding had already been reached. What remained was response. Across the city, Dutch Schultz could feel it in ways he could no longer ignore. The subtle pressure that had once seemed like coincidence had now become unmistakable. Not a rebellion, but a steady withdrawal of something far more valuable than control. Acceptance. His name still carried weight, but it no longer moved through Harlem the same way. It didn't open doors as easily. There was a hesitation, now a pause that hadn't existed before. And for a man who had built his influence on momentum, that pause felt like resistance. Not loud, not direct, but undeniable. Inside his inner circle, the shift was even clearer. The men who once followed without question had begun to think more carefully, to speak more cautiously. Not out of fear of Bumpy, but out of recognition that something had changed, something deeper than strategy or territory. It wasn't about, had slipped. The man responsible for the incident had become a reflection of that loss. He carried himself differently, now not with confidence, but with something close to unease. He avoided certain streets, certain conversations, certain eyes. Not because anyone had threatened him, but because no one needed to. He could feel. In the way people looked at him. In the way they didn't. In the absence of respect that once came easily. Because respect, once broken, does not disappear quietly, it leaves a space. And that space is felt by everyone. By the time the fourth evening settled over the city, not announced but understood, it would not take place. It would happen where it mattered, where the city itself could witness what came next. And when Bumpy arrived, he did so the same way he always had. He walked into the space as if it already belonged to him, not through ownership, but through presence. People were already there, not gathered in a crowd, but positioned in a way that made it clear they were watching, not for spectacle, but for resolution. Schultz's men stood across from him, their posture different now, not confrontational, not relaxed, just, for the first time since this had begun, there was no illusion of control in his movement, no assumption that he could dictate the outcome. There was only recognition of what had happened, of what had followed, and of what now stood in front of him. He did not close the distance, because he didn't need to. The distance had already been defined. For a few seconds, nothing was said. And in those seconds, everything was understood. It was Schultz. There was no defense, no justification, no attempt to minimize what had been done. Because even he knew that would only make it worse. Instead, his words came carefully, measured not for effect, but for truth. What happened shouldn't have happened. The sentence was simple, but in its simplicity, it carried weight. Not because it erased anything, but because it acknowledged it. Because this was not about hearing words, understanding intent. Schultz continued, his tone no longer carrying the sharpness it once had. There are lines, he said, that a man doesn't cross if he understands what kind of man he is. Another pause. And if he does, his voice lowered slightly, then he learns. The words hung in the air, not as an excuse, not as a defense, but as an acceptance of consequence. Bumpy finally moved not forward, not closer, but just enough to shift the moment. His voice was exactly as it had always been, calm, steady, unshaken. Respect isn't something you fix with words, he said quietly. It's something you show. After you've lost it, no anger, no accusation. Just truth. And that truth landed heavier than anything else that could have been said. Because it made one thing clear. This wasn't over, not yet. What came next would matter more than anything that had already happened. The man responsible was brought forward, not forced, not dragged, but present in a way that made it clear. He could no longer hide behind anything. For the first time, he stood in front of Bumpy, not as someone protected by position, but as someone defined by his actions. And in that moment, the weight of everything settled fully. He didn't speak. Immediately, because for the first time he understood. Not fear, not consequence, but understanding. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried something it had never carried before. Not confidence, not arrogance, but humility. I was wrong. The words were quiet, but they were real. And sometimes, real is all that matters. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full. Full of everything that had led to this moment. Full of everything that would follow. Bumpy looked at him, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Then he nodded, just once, not as forgiveness, not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement that the truth had been spoken. And in that moment, something shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently, because the situation had not been resolved through force. It had been corrected through understanding, through accountability. The crowd began to disperse slowly, not because they were dismissed, but because they understood it was over. Not forgotten, not erased, but resolved. And as Bumpy turned to leave, the city seemed to move with him, not following, not watching, but simply returning to itself. Because Harlem had not needed a fight. It had needed a reminder. That dignity cannot be pushed down a staircase and left behind. That respect, once broken, must be rebuilt, not demanded. and that the strongest men are not the ones who react the fastest, but the ones who choose the right moment to act. As the night settled back into its rhythm, quieter now, steadier, there was one thing everyone understood, something that did not need to be spoken again. Some lessons are not taught through force. They are learned through silence, and in the end, it wasn't power that changed them, it was understanding.